Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for attending this morning for a patient safety-based approach for assessing medical device security risks. We have a great group of presenters today from the AbedGraham Group and MedCrypt. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to them to get us started.
And if you have any questions throughout the webinar, don't hesitate to pop them into the Q&A box on the left or raise your hand and we will come to you and ask questions. Great. Axel, you want to kick us off?
Sure. Thanks everybody for joining today. My name is Axel Worth. I'm the Chief Security Strategist at MedCrypt, and I am joined here by a group of colleagues and good friends in the industry, Vidya.
Hey everyone, my name is Vidya Murthy. I am the VP of Ops at MedCrypt. Prior to this, I used to work for a large medical device manufacturer.
Hi, I'm Dr. Gabriel Ma, a Senior Clinical Strategist at the AbedGraham Group. Unfortunately, my colleague, Dr. Saif Abed, Director of Cybersecurity Advisory Services, has been called away with medical emergencies. I'll be speaking on his behalf. We're a physician-led technology and advisory services group, supporting technology companies and healthcare providers and government agencies in improving healthcare-related outcomes through cybersecurity. That's it.
Great. So for those who were here, hopefully you were drawn to us because you saw our white paper. If not, we worked together to write a pretty robust white paper. You can check it out at medcrypt.com/whitepapers. Our stuff is not marketing at all. It's very kind of academic in nature. So we invite you to read that and share any thoughts that you have. So to set the stage, why does any of this matter, right? I think the initial view on what cybersecurity in healthcare meant was really limited to this notion of we're trying to comply with HIPAA, or we want to make sure that our health information is secure in some way and we don't become a hospital that's in the headlines because we had a breach. But I think over the last decade, we've really seen this evolution where devices are increasingly connected. And this has to do with trying to improve a clinical outcome. A scenario is such that a patient can be treated better if there are multiple data points that you can only get by having connectivity. So we started adding this connectivity to devices and didn't really grow in a way that was systemic, but more of a, oh, this could be a really interesting clinical use, or this could be really helpful for practitioners and clinicians. And so as things became increasingly connected, you were welcomed with this amount of data and insight that could really change a patient's outcome. But at the same time, you suddenly had all these things that were connected to each other. And I think what used to happen is for a really long time, device manufacturers would kind of do what they could in isolation, and then it would be passed on to a hospital. And the hospital would now be faced with this burden of, well, I have 10,000 plus connected devices. How do I sufficiently secure this in a way that I'm comfortable with having insight into? And most hospitals would say, well, we don't have the technical prowess to add cybersecurity to a really complex surgical robots. And that's fair, right? They can't really add security onto a device afterwards. So you end up with this expanded landscape of additional things that are connected without really having security built into their development necessarily. And as COVID has shown us, there's kind of this increased push of this meta trend that was already there of pushing healthcare outside of the four walls of a hospital. So now hospitals are trying to manage devices that are operating in a person's home or that are being sent out to patients or clinics remotely. And it kind of expanded this breadth of what needs to be secured, which is increasingly difficult as you have less kind of contact with it. And all this ultimately says, right, we're doing this because we want to enhance clinical outcomes, but at the same time, are we potentially trading that off for new ways that a patient could be impacted by a device malfunctioning? So kind of the underlying notion here is we want to ultimately secure care for patients, which is why we need to think about this other facet of what's part of that supply chain.
And so then in that context, we came to the underlying question for the white paper, and why we took the approach in the white paper, where we basically looked at various assessment methodologies that can be used to assess cyber risk and cyber vulnerabilities in medical devices. And then one thing we need to realize is that there are many methodologies out there, but in a sense, they're all models, they're all abstractions of reality, and they're all trying to predict the future, meaning what is actually the risk of a device being compromised at some point in the future. And having said that, we need to realize that these models and these methodologies were all developed for a very specific purpose. And even though they are good models within the context of that purpose, that use case, there are limitations we need to understand. For example, some methodologies describe risk at a software component level, which is very different than describing the risk of the entire device that is the sum of all its components. They also may be limited in terms of describing not only the complete device, but also the risk of the integrated system. It's not just, as Vidya was saying today, an issue about the individual device anymore. It is really a systems problem where we have multiple devices being integrated with each other and exchanging data with each other, and therefore we have what we call a collateral damage potential, that a coincidental incident on one device could very well trickle down the chain and affect other devices, and could have not only cybersecurity impact, but also patient safety and care delivery impacts. And therefore, many of the existing methodologies today really describe risk and describe vulnerabilities quite correctly, but may miss the clinical context and the clinical use case. Next slide, please. I get you muted.
Sorry about that. So rather than just repeating the information covered in the white paper in the same way, I thought it'd be more insightful to go over the rationale into why and how we decided on the use cases that we featured. So there's a number of articles, examples out there discussing the impact of medical devices when they're compromised with newly discovered vulnerabilities and the potential impact on patient safety. Often these devices are providing direct care to patients. They're attached to them or close proximity to them. Things such as pacemakers, infusion pumps, patient monitors, or anesthetic machines. And there could be an understandably, strong emotional reaction when you can almost instinctively picture the potential harm that could occur. And that's why we chose to look into this type of scenario as our first use case. We felt that an infusion pump providing pain relief to a post-operative surgical patient on the high dependency unit with a high scoring vulnerability on the device would be representative of these types of situations. But we also wanted to make a point that whilst these types of patient safety concerns are addressed, we do need to look at the clinical context to get a more accurate picture of what may happen if such a device is compromised. There will be a degree of mitigating factors that actually reduce the impact. So you may have clinical supervisors around keeping an eye on patients, other devices nearby that could be swapped in with similar functionality, and also the fact that some of the effects will be limited to effects on that individual patient rather than it being spread further. So an example may be that you have an anesthetic machine that sort of gets compromised, and your initial sort of worry is that, if you're in the middle of a procedure, surgical procedure, and this happens, is there going to be harm to this patient? Well, with a clinical eye, you recognize that there's going to need statistics about and lots of other medical stuff about who can tend to the patient whilst another device is then brought in. So this would result in a delay of services rather than actual harm to the patient. In the sense of device integrity, if that's compromised, it's usually quite a complex understanding that's required about this device and the clinical workflows to cause something that would get the maximum impact as a targeted attack. So, for example, if you have a patient monitor that's changed to show asystole where the heart trace has no activity, yet when you look at the patient, they're sitting up and talking, you're going to sort of view that in the sense that you're not going to do anything different that's going to compromise the care of the patient. And it's going to be dismissed as an erroneous reading, and that another device will be sort of come in to swap it in. And it's useful to look at this scenario because when we then contrast this to the wider setting, which we think is more representative, or you might find in a hospital, we have multiple devices, a combination of different sets of vulnerabilities and varying severities. You get a case like our second one in the HDU, where you've got medical devices, many peripheral monitoring devices such as oxygen saturation meters, blood pressure monitors, and they may be connected to other infrastructure components, hubs and applications that will collate the information from a wide number of patients, giving a larger scale situation. And so whilst these individual peripheral devices could be compromised, the direct impact to the individual patient may be limited to that one person, but there's a bigger concern of this device acting as an entry point to these other larger systems involved in the care of a higher volume of patients. So we also wanted this to be a more pragmatic scenario. So when we did this, we wanted to include assets with lower scoring vulnerabilities as well, not just all critical ones, as we didn't want to exaggerate the scenario. So in terms of our assessment methodology on the next slide, this was a collaborative exercise with Axel and Vidya at MedCrypt, and the expertise on medical devices throughout the entire life cycle provided a fantastic qualitative perspective, covering the security profile of medical devices in healthcare, technical analysis of vulnerabilities, the relative risk and best practices, and gave us a great insight into historical ways that risk has been looked at and how to move forward. From a quantitative perspective, we wanted to translate the technical jargon associated with vulnerabilities and try to contextualize these for more specificity within healthcare. So while CVSS scores do give us some quantitative value, we feel at AbedGraham that more can be done on how this vulnerability score would inform how patient safety and clinical service delivery is actually affected. If, for example, if you take a vulnerability, which is scoring 9 out of 10 on the CVSS, and that's located on an endpoint such as a CT machine, how would that actually inform you to understand how the impact would be on healthcare delivery? Obviously, the risk varies depending on where and how an asset might be used. So if you have a situation where you have 2 identical CT machines, but they're located in different areas, one in an acute care setting where the function is to look at head traumas, strokes, managing acute abdomen and surgical intervention required, versus another CT machine which is located in a sort of more outpatient scenario with more elective and diagnostic, less time-sensitive measures, you can already see that the risk of care and harm to patients can be higher at the emergency care, the acute care setting where that CT machine is located. And it demonstrates that one asset can have multiple scenarios and multiple contexts that change the score you might give it. So with our CCOM squared clinical security analytics platform, we have some algorithmic models that take the number of the behavioral attributes, clinical workflows and interdependencies, score and rank these different assets across a variety of the potential scenarios. And we have this on a kind of on a 12-point scale in different areas of the clinical, financial, organizational, regulatory areas. Clinical pertains to potential safety or patient harm that could occur. Organizational pertains to sort of workflow disruption of service shutdown that could occur. Financial refers to recovery and regulatory costs as well as revenue losses that could occur. And the regulatory risk is around sort of the severity of intervention from regulators following disruption and degree of reputational damage. So as well as each area has a score, we also have a combined total score to try to give us a holistic overview. Yeah, at the same time, by looking into the individual scores, it could be tailored to different stakeholder interests if they have a particular interest in a clinical area or financial area. And this offers a granularity where you may have similar all-round scores between 2 different assets, but they may have different constituent scores. So you may have an asset that has a higher clinical impact but lower scalable impacts versus another one with lower clinical impact but a higher degree of scalable impacts. So in this case, an infusion pump, you could see how it affects a person directly, but a patient monitoring hub, for example, might have an indirect harm because it's more monitoring, but the effects can be on multiple, several patients. And we feel that this kind of level of granularity allows a bigger holistic discussion amongst all the shareholders and enables them to come to a shared agreement or policy decisions about how they might proceed with further remediation steps. Axel, pass on to you.
Okay, thank you. So the conclusion, and as video was saying, there's much more detail in the white paper. We don't want to repeat all of that here, but clearly, if you look at the problem of medical device security, it is clear that we need to understand and prioritize clinical risk, and that clinical risk is much more complex than what sometimes gets distilled down to the pure technical level. As Gabe was saying, we need to include and consider clinical workflows. We need to look at the integrated context of the device, both the technical but also the clinical function integration. We need to understand interdependencies, and we need to be conscious of scalability as those systems of systems in different organizations may have different degrees of complexity and impact on the large organization. So the technical methodologies, like for example, is CVSS, but there are several others out there that could be referenced. They certainly have their purpose and their justification in the technical context. And when you're assessing the vulnerabilities and the risks of individual software components, CVSS is pretty much the established standard. But it can indeed deliver profoundly different results compared to the more complex analysis in the clinical context. And I think these technical assessment methodologies that were developed in the pure software space are less suitable in the clinical context and are certainly less suitable to guide organizations in the remediation of discovered vulnerabilities and risk, and also guide them in the incident response should a security event occur. So clearly that more complex approach has significant benefits, and it is much more useful in the context of a tangible description in the clinical and business context, meaning we understand better the clinical workflow dependencies, the potential workflow bottlenecks the failure of such a device could create. Gabe was referring to the CT scanner earlier, that maybe in an emergency department is a critical unit in terms of assessing, for example, cardiac emergencies and suspected cases of stroke. Clearly, if that device goes down, that creates a diagnostic bottleneck, which then will result in patient impact and could potentially impact both morbidity and mortality, potentially even in both. Could result in financial implications on the organization, could result in regulatory impact, and then finally also could result in reputational damage. Vidya?
So I think going through this exercise was interesting to me, right? As someone who's been in device-based security for a little bit and really seen a lot of the headlines around pacemakers being hacked, or the media headlines, oh my gosh, this device manufacturer had a vulnerability that was a 9.9, the highest ever. I think it was insightful for me to get the clinical context and really understand kind of this nuanced view. And as much as we want to have a quantitative way of thinking about cybersecurity, I think that's just the nature of people that are interested in cybersecurity. Maybe is you need a way to rank and know what to fix first. It becomes an easy thing to point to. And I think this white paper exercise really showed me that there was so much more that we're missing. And even though everyone talks about kind of the failures of CVSS, I think we don't necessarily understand, well, what's the alternative here, right? Like, it kind of is what it is, but are we looking for a better solution? Is there something else out there that we can think about? I think it's often that the glitzy headlines are what grabs folks' attention, but it becomes evident that there's significantly more to think about and really prioritize how we want to approach addressing a device security. And I think this more than ever highlights the fact that this burden can't sit on a hospital side to try to resolve, right? If we are truly looking at the sufficiency of what we are offering from a security perspective, it can't be that we keep blaming our end users for being insufficient at managing the clinical context of their device and not understanding what they're doing. I think it highlights the fact that we need to be more proactive in building security into these devices, and not just at the point of design, but really thinking about it over the life cycle of that device, because these devices live significantly longer than what the technology in it is meant to be advanced for at that time. So I'd invite Axel and Gabe to share kind of if there was something that was most compelling for them as they kind of work through this white paper.
So maybe I get started, and I think for me, as somebody who comes at the problem from a more technical background, and I was aware of the challenges we talked about, the challenge of translating a technical approach to assessment, to a more comprehensive and clinical approach. I was quite aware of that, but at the same time, I was still quite impressed by the level of granularity and the level of insight that was actually added to this discussion through the cooperation with Gabe and Saeed, and their methodology and understanding the depth of that approach.
Ooh.
Gabe, you're muted.
We can barely hear you. No, nothing. Nothing. While he sorts out his audio, I would remind folks to share questions in the Q&A box. We would love for this to be a bit interactive and to hear what folks are feeling in the industry. You want to try now, Gabe? Nope.
So maybe while we wait, I'll make another comment, and that kind of expands on what I was saying earlier, and that is the really the need to understand the cascade effect, right? And that is both the technical cascade and how one vulnerability in a software component can affect a larger device, can affect the integrated system of devices. That's again the technical cascade, but there's also then a clinical and business cascade that a failure of a device can impact not only the operational capabilities of an organization, but also can then have long-term consequences, everything from regulatory issues, potential data breaches, financial impact, reputational issues, and so forth. So clearly, taking a more complex look at these kinds of issues is advisable. And Gabe, I think we can hear you now. We're hearing some background noise. Want to try again? No.
Yeah, for me at least, I think that the notion of being done with security is something that we falsely talk about a lot, right? That the idea that it's a point in time and you're going to be sufficient once the FDA kind of says, yes, you can sell your device into the market is something that we need to move away from. And I think the unfortunate reality is if you can't translate why during security is good for kind of patient outcome or for a business case, it can be hard to build that sort of consensus within an organization to really rally around investing in this, because it is an investment, right? And you really want to think about how do you do it in a way that's going to support optimal clinical outcomes. And I think that's often a difficult bridge for folks to move through, and getting this clinical context, I think, is helpful because it gives insight into how this actually plays out in real life, and what a clinician would actually see and have to deal with in the instance of a device going down for whatever reason. One of the questions I often get is, what is the show me the body count to demonstrate why we need to spend this money, right? Like show me the loss of life as a result of one of these devices going wrong. And I think that's somewhat of a fatalistic way of looking at this, right? The notion that we need to wait for a really adverse event to happen before we react is not a privilege that we get in healthcare. I think if you look at devices, it's often thought that it's just like an IoT device. And I think this is evidence that it's not, right? The worst that can happen when a thermostat gets broken in a person's home is that the house gets really hot, maybe. And it's quite obvious that someone can experience that. But do we really want to wait for some really adverse outcome to happen because of a device not functioning? And I think the obvious answer is no, we don't want to wait for that to happen. And we can't wait for that to happen because that moment will just be so unfortunate and unnecessary, because we understand and we can model out what this looks like in terms of actual patient outcome. So Axel, I know that you've been in this space for a while, and you've thought a lot about why healthcare is kind of the growing space and a different type of risk. Any additional insights on kind of how this translates into real life?
I mean, if we look at the big picture, right, what is going on in the healthcare industry, clearly we're all aware of the growing pressure on participating organizations to improve their security posture. Doesn't matter whether it's healthcare providers or manufacturers of medical devices. The FDA is stepping up their pressure. Other international regulators are stepping up their pressure. We've seen an increase in HIPAA audits, HIPAA fines for the healthcare provider side. So clearly the need is recognized that security in healthcare, because of the potentially profound implications you mentioned, Vidya, we need to do better. We need to improve our security posture. Yet, unfortunately, there's no evidence that we're making progress. The number of breaches reported by U.S. hospitals increases more than 20% year over year. The number of medical device vulnerabilities reported to ICS Search here in the US by medical device manufacturers is still increasing. Right? So I think we as an industry are still behind in getting ahead of the bad guys. Right? I think we have not found that path we need to take to start closing the gap, start getting ahead of the adversaries.
Gabe, you want to try your audio?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yay!
Yes. Okay, good. So yeah, unfortunately I missed some of that, but what I was going to say earlier was about the CVSS scoring and how to sort of take the context of that. So, you may have situations where you have a device that has a high CVSS score, but it may be sort of an isolated machine somewhere that's not used very often. It's not connected to many sort of other systems. And then you'll have another machine that will have a lower CVSS score that you might not think is critical, but that might be connected to a number of important systems and is connected 24/7. So you might initially go, oh, well, these have got high CVSS scores, let's go and remediate this device. But you may be missing out opportunities for devices that have lower scores and addressing that. And so understanding the clinical context on top of that will help make the decisions in remediation. So that's what I was trying to say earlier before I got cut off.
No, completely. I think it's often, we hope that we can find a single way to solve this challenge across all of healthcare. And I think our value chain is just so much more complicated than that, right? You have to have these multiple layers. You have to have these multiple stakeholders that understand what it even means to have a cybersecurity risk. And without sufficiently kind of moving everyone's responsibility, I don't know that we'll ever sufficiently get to the point where we can be secure by just pushing kind of one angle. And I'm curious, Gabe, maybe you can talk a little bit about kind of cybersecurity awareness in the clinical context. Do you find the average clinician understands what cybersecurity is about or how it may manifest in their treatment plan?
I mean, in honesty, most clinicians are just really trying to get on with their workflow and just provide clinical care. So a lot of the times, it's not unknown. They'll be doing workarounds and shortcuts to navigate any kind of security measures, often sort of increasing risk significantly by doing that. And I think, this is kind of why the CECON platform, when we talk about the clinical, organizational, financial, and regulatory aspects of it, it allows these multiple stakeholders to actually look at the different priority areas and have discussions between themselves, because it may be that things are both equally important to each stakeholder with their different agendas, but they haven't had that conversation. We know that a lot of things in healthcare are quite siloed. So just even having a platform that promotes these different stakeholders to have those conversations and actually see the other person's perspective, if they can look across at this platform and say, okay, I see where you're coming from your side. I can see why you've invested so much time to that, and I can see. Then you can make decisions about risks and benefits and decide where that medium may be. I mean, there isn't going to be, as you said, an exact science to it, but I think at least prompting those discussions in organizations where they can actually put their own weighting as to what they feel is most important is a way that we can start that conversation and really move things forward that way.
Yeah, I completely agree. Bringing that transparency, I think, is something security practitioners are somewhat remiss to do sometimes, right? We don't necessarily want to show all the secrets of how we've secured a device or how it potentially has vulnerabilities. But if we were actually open and more communicative with the shareholder community in a way that's secure and doesn't cause kind of panic to patients, but is sufficiently precise so folks that are impacted by a potential vulnerability can do something about it. I think there's definitely a path forward there that would really compellingly move the needle on what we're doing in healthcare. So I'd love to have any questions, folks. I know there's kind of what happens next, right? We've all kind of talked about this notion of understanding clinicians. I think that the biggest idea is that you wouldn't go today and start building your own data center. You would turn to AWS or some sort of cloud provider and say, this is where they are an expert and I want to leverage that from both a scalability, a security, and cost perspective. And I think in security, that's very much true. We really need to think about how do we leverage folks that have been thinking about this problem for a really long time and been trying to solve it in a healthcare context first, and leverage that insight to really change what it is that we're doing going forward. And I think if we sufficiently do that, there is a realistic chance that we can actively change what the threat landscape looks like in healthcare. I mean, every day it feels like during the pandemic, there's some new report that's coming out saying this new area has been attacked by cyber criminals, or healthcare has had the highest number of breaches until now. Telehealth has been bombed. There's so many things that this past year has shown us in terms of vulnerabilities in our ecosystem that we really have to think about a systemic change in terms of security and thinking about how we can trickle that across the various parts of the value chain and not just kind of idiosyncratically solve it per use case just to get by to the next week of care or the next 510K approval. It really has to be something that changes across the board. And with that, I would welcome any questions. Kate, I don't know if any folks have typed stuff in or if folks on the line want to raise their hand and ask something. But I would love to hear some of the stories that folks are facing out there and some of the situations and what they're dealing with.
Yeah, so you can either use the chat function on the left side of your screen, or you can request to speak and we can unmute you.
It's an interesting thing, right? If we think about the impact of cybersecurity, if you look at the trends that are happening across kind of tech in general, you're starting to see more of these very pervasive vulnerabilities that aren't just healthcare specific. It's no longer a person buying a pump off of eBay and finding a vulnerability for just that pump. Instead, they're saying, hey, I have this vulnerability in this chip, and this chip spans every industry imaginable, hundreds, if not thousands of devices impacted kind of instantly. And I think that trend is something that we're likely to see continuing and becomes that much more important to understanding if that kind of component-based risk impacts our clinical and patient outcome because of the use case of what that device is doing. Axel, I know you've spent some time looking at kind of meta trends out there. Is there anything that you would add to that?
I mean, you make a valid point in the sense that every healthcare provider organization you speak to will tell you horror stories what happened internally. Once something like Urgent 11 or Ripple 20 or Amnesia 33, and you name it, one of these complex and highly embedded vulnerabilities was announced, right? That really resulted in a wild goose chase within the organization to find not only the devices that were affected, but also what the effect actually is, right? What is actually the risk to that given device? And that question goes way beyond whether they had the affected software running on the device. Right? It really goes back to some of the points we made previously. Not only does the device run the software, but is actually this vulnerability exploitable the way it is implemented? And if that answer is yes, is it actually relevant in the clinical context? And as Gabe was pointing out earlier, that answer could be quite different and could be either higher or lower than the pure technical assessment by a methodology like, for example, CVSS.
Yeah, I think if we can look at other industries for inspiration or potentially what the future looks like, I think it becomes very obvious how nascent we are in terms of building a really robust security posture in healthcare, and that the complexity of our ecosystem doesn't help that, right? We're not a single app-based solution that lives on AWS. It's a very intricate ecosystem that has a real patient at the end of it. So it's certainly I think we're going to see an increased trend in that impacting kind of our world a little bit more profoundly than it has historically. Great. Well, I really appreciate everyone's time in attending. I thank our co-presenters in putting this together. If there are any questions that come up after this or after you've read the white paper, please don't hesitate to reach out and drop us a line. We would love to continue the conversation. We think there is hope. This isn't all doom and gloom. I think it's all about us building a solution that actually works for healthcare and is meant for healthcare. And if we are sufficiently motivated to do so, I think we can compellingly change what our threat landscape looks like going forward. So thank you all for your time. Keep well, stay healthy, and we will see you all hopefully soon. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, Beck.